On today's episode of the Power Podcast, I'm joined by William Doering. He's an adjunct professor at the John E. Simon School of Business at Maryville University, and he's also the director in the Science and Infrastructure practice with Guidehouse. Welcome to the show, William. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do in these two roles?
Sure thing, and I appreciate the time today. I'll admit to being a fan of the podcast and listening to some of the back episodes in preparation for today. So as part of my role, I work as an adjunct faculty at Maryville University, and in that, teaching in their business data analytics program, as well as in their MBA program and their Masters of Accounting. And I think some of the unique things that Maryville is kind of bringing to the table there is an alternative view to some of those degrees. And the intent behind all of those is to make sure that they have business focus. For us, the concept of kind of academic excellence is one thing, but being able to understand what the value behind the education and the ability to bring those new skill sets to bear for, where our students will eventually go to work is very critical for us. So it's really shaped the way that they've built that program, and I'm just very happy to be a part of it. I've been teaching there for about the past 2.5, 3 years now, so really glad to be a part of that. And then concurrent to all that, as if a busy day could never get busier, I also, like you mentioned, I'm a director with Guidehouse in their Science and Infrastructure practice, and I specifically address the power and utilities market, focusing a lot in the T&D space, but also have worked with different types of utilities, whether that's a shareholder-held muni co-ops, and have worked in several different arenas, whether it's U.S., Canada, Western Europe, and Australia. So I've been working in the utility space since 2005, serving, I think now, including some of the sub companies and parents that I've worked with, just at 40 utilities over that 15 years.
All right, so you've been pretty active in the utility space, and I'm sure you've got a lot of great information to share with us. The first thing I'd like to get into is some of that hacking that's going on, and I know there's been some reports out that Russia has done some hacking in the U.S. electric grid, and that they may have embedded programs that could be activated at times. What do you think about those reports? Is there any evidence of this type of activity? And if so, why haven't they done anything with it to date, and what are they waiting for?
Well, I think that the question is interesting to pose, and the consideration that I would give it is this. I recently came back from Distributech just this past February, and we had a breakout session there with some of the folks from NFC. There's kind of a crowdsourced effort to look at a scenario just like this. What is the potential for infection? What is the potential for fallout? And the question that we first realized was, it's not a question of if, it's more a question of did it or has it already happened? And more often than not, the consensus of the room was, yes, it had. And so the two questions that we started answering after that is, how do you cleanse infection, and how do you ensure reliability after the fact? And so, I think the evidence for that, I can't point to a specific situation and say this client has suffered this issue. I think that we've seen situations like Stuxnet or the infrastructure penetration that we saw in Ukraine in, 2014, 2015. We start to see evidence that there were definitely trial runs of things or actually executed efforts in kind of a consolidated fashion. That for us to think that something like that hasn't happened yet is definitely on the riskier side of optimistic.
Yeah, it sounds like if you don't think it's happened, you're probably putting your head in the sand and just ignoring the signs. What types of things do you think bad actors would be capable of doing to our system? I mean, how embedded are these programs, do you think?
So I think that's where the modern utility, especially if we take a distribution utility as our good example right now, interconnectivity is one of those things that is absolutely driving the market and driving the industry. The move from kind of manually read meters to AMR to AMI, and now with AMI adding in IoT type devices or intelligent utility network devices or other smart grid capabilities, the potential threat vectors went from, the firewall at corporate headquarters to being every one of these distributed network available devices. So, in some cases, that's in the magnitude of millions of just what are the opportunities for breach. Then the question is, what can someone do with that? And I think that's where pessimism, unfortunately, becomes the thing where you want to lean on to kind of come up with what are those real world examples that we need to appropriately prepare for and plan around.
And I assume there's probably more than just Russians that are working on these things. We've always assumed that China and North Korea and perhaps even some terrorist-type groups like ISIS or others could be doing similar actions. And do they have that type of knowledge base, and do they have the wherewithal to also be hacking into these systems and embedding things? What do you think of that?
I think the level of sophistication that state level actors provide is in many cases astounding. And I think the biggest struggle that we continue to see is in cases like the WikiLeaks leak that happened last summer, where some of the day zero exploits and tools that had been developed by even stateside capabilities were generally released. And so the scariest thing now is not just that state actors are playing. I think that's kind of the presumption that I continue to hear from various folks around the industry, is that state actors are absolutely doing things. But now there's also the risk of these state actor level tools that were just extremely sophisticated, extremely complex, and potentially devastating, now also are available to kind of a lower level of mass, right? Where you have that exposure now of those complex tools to potentially individuals or individual groups with far more difficult to ascertain kind of
goals or
approach to these things.
Yeah,
exactly, goals. And so I think that everybody's used to the ransomware kind of perspective of somebody's just looking for, can they get paid to help you unlock your computer? And I think that's, in some cases, that's potentially best case scenario, because those are typically a little less scary than the alternative of, starting to look at those worst case scenarios where operations becomes potentially threatened or compromised.
Yeah, as long as you mentioned the worst case scenarios, I mean, what are some of the worst case scenarios? What could happen, or what type of destruction or, I guess, problems could be implemented with some of these hacks?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where the focus is, understanding the potential fallout. And in this case, for me, if I kind of harken back to that conversation we had at Distributech, one of the very interesting scenarios that we floated out there and started to discuss was, imagine, one worst case scenario. You have a natural disaster, and at that point, you have utilities working across the country to help each other, where they send crews, they send they send crews, resources, whatever it is, to help support whoever's trying to recover. And to me, the truly catastrophic, if you have a situation where somebody's trying to create the maximum impact, it's a situation where they execute against, those compromised resources out in the field. And so say they have, some substation equipment that they can compromise, and knowing the limited vendor capability, the limited quantity of vendors in the field for some of these things, if it's infected in one model, but that model is prevalent across the industry, then they have the ability to potentially activate something at a national level, compounding the existing natural disaster. And I think that's the worst case scenario, because for any utility that's provided support to their neighbor to then find themselves under an attack like this and compromise themselves, you have the ability to kind of really impact infrastructure at a large scale perspective,
and perhaps take out people who have the wherewithal to repair these systems. And if you lose your people, you can't make repairs. Is that kind of the idea there?
Yeah, and I think that one of the biggest things that I continue to look at with the power and utilities industry is this: people measure reliability of service not at a 70%, 80%, et cetera. I think that everybody's used to, I dial my phone and I drop a call, I just dial that phone again. But every experience that I've ever encountered where somebody would flip on a light switch and it doesn't turn on, the response to that is immediate and emotional, where they flip it 3 more times and flip it a couple more times, and then eventually comes back on, and there's that tremendous sigh of relief. And I think that some of the biggest risk is not, we've caused the loss of, an individual unit or individual assets in the field. I think it's compromising that reliability and that faith in infrastructure, but also the potential fallout to economy, civil service, whatever that is. If you interrupt service for 2 days, 4 days, et cetera, it becomes some of those things that compound. So I think what we saw a kind of a scary use case for that when they had the large interconnect outage in the early 2000s up in the Northeast, where folks out of service for beyond a week, things started to devolve fairly quickly. And I think a situation like that becomes worst case scenario very, very quickly for a lot of folks trying to do kind of recovery preparedness type exercises, where knowing that you don't have an ability to stage from a place where things are quote okay. And I think that to me starts to hint at a really frightening worst case scenario.
It is an emotional thing when you lose power. If you can't be on the computer, if you can't use your phone, if you can't turn on the lights or make coffee in the morning, oh my gosh, it's a catastrophe. So I think it is a mindset, particularly for modern society like the U.S. People are used to their conveniences, and not having those for an hour or a day or a week would be, very disturbing, I guess you'd say, or it would be a very difficult situation to be in.
Yeah, and I think that the level of disruption is really hard to gauge, and I think it varies based on the level of preparedness and the diversity that those preparation plans potentially have. And I think that there's a lot of new infrastructural changes that we're looking at that can potentially become an offset. So, good examples of that are things like building microgrids around critical infrastructure where they have the ability to do generation plus storage. And I'm not saying that that's the only answer, but those kind of a combined portfolio of solutions, I think, provides a lot of resilience against a situation like this. So if you can, isolate or create redundancy around critical infrastructure, even beyond what's in place today, it continues to build up our ability to resist a situation like this.
I don't remember if it was a year or two ago. I was actually watching a Senate hearing or a House hearing that was going on in Capitol Hill, and Ted Koppel was speaking, and he was really setting the stage for catastrophe and talking about geomagnetic disturbances and electromagnetic pulses and how these would affect the power grid, and he had talked about China being embedded in our power grid. Do you worry about any of those things at all, GMDs or EMPs?
Yeah, and I think, again, it comes back to the concern I have over them is not them as a one-off. I think that those are that kind of act of God or force majeure is a hard thing to say we've planned everything around it. If that was the case, the Hollywood blockbusters would not be so compelling to watch every summer and scare ourselves with. But I think for me, it's the ones where you compound those with, the bad actor, where it's the movie is always saved by kind of grand acts of humanity. And if we were to take that disaster and combine it with somebody with malicious intent, that's when it really becomes kind of the horror film that none of us really want to watch. So I think that absolutely those things concern me, and I think that the industry as a whole continues to look at them and try to figure out ways to work together around those. Again, it goes back to that's a story without a bad guy. Mm-hmm. It's the stories with a bad guy that scare me the most.
And I know recovering from these sorts of things can be really time-consuming because transformers, for instance, large transformers that are used at power plants and in large substations can take months to repair or to replace. Do you think enough is being done to prepare for situations where they might be needed? Should the government be stockpiling these sorts of things? Should others, should utilities be expected to have these on hand? What are your feelings on that?
I think the struggle with preparedness from a redundancy perspective is the insight provided before the event is never as insightful as the insight afterwards. There's that perspective of the we should have known after it happened. Beforehand, I think the hard part is if you have limited resources on how to prepare, selecting the appropriate level of preparation is crucial. And so I don't think any utility or even, a government actor has the ability to do all of the things. So I think instead what we do is try to prioritize and understand where do our limited resources bear the most fruit. And I think that, I see a lot of folks working on things like optimizing where they put their investments is really kind of a new way of looking at things. So rather than just looking at I have a hunch that this could happen, taking a enterprise level view and developing a common framework for determining value, and whether that's economic value to the folks you're providing for, or it's resilience with a kind of a value against risk. I think utilities defining what that looks like and working together with their vendors and each other to kind of understand what resilience really should look like in some of these cases is important. We see a lot of that when, we have a hurricane and it's X utility doesn't have enough on site, so they reach out to their neighbors. So I don't think that it'll ever be I am self-sustaining all by myself. It'll always be kind of a more complex web of interconnected peers. For me, the place where I see the most value put in is the information sharing. I happened to sit with a guy a couple of years ago, and he was explaining, very early on of the, as we saw the rise of cybersecurity as a critical need, he talked about it from the perspective of, everybody was familiar with the concept of cybersec, and too many folks saw that as cyber secrets rather than cybersecurity. And what he meant behind that was, the idea of I can solve my own is frightening, because at that point then, the only thing I'm protected against is the things that I am creative enough to potentially come up with. Whereas if I am able to expand that scope and draw from these sources and look at, whether it's peers or, other kind of providers and identify vulnerabilities that are beyond just what my in-house team thought of, I think that that's the critical piece. You mentioned a while ago about the burying your head in the sand. I think the volume of data that's available and the lessons learned that we see on a daily basis from situations like Stuxnet, or from the Ukraine hacks, or from even some of the releases that we've seen on zero-day exploits, whether it's WikiLeaks or otherwise, I think that the critical piece for the critical lesson learned for me is the always be learning, always be working with your peers, be working with your vendors, identifying situations where the first thing that we need to do is question our assumptions. Understanding that the way we always expect it to work may not always be the case. And so investing in additional perspective is absolutely crucial for everybody within the industry.
That's a great point. I think there's a common mentality in the power industry to not necessarily want to share everything, to just kind of keep it quiet and, try to fix the problem and not make a big deal about it. But in the grand scheme of things, by sharing the information, getting the lessons learned out there, everybody can benefit, and that's a great solution to the problem.
Yeah, and I think that the U.S. market, at least when you move down from the generation wholesale side and you go into kind of the less competitive distribution and transmission spaces, I see a lot more of that sharing kind of firsthand as I work with some of my clients, where things like user groups are very easy to build up, because when you're not competing for customers, you become a lot more collaborative in the how do I ensure operations. I continue to hear utilities kind of focus on three pieces of a triangle, one of them being reliability, affordability, and safety. And the one thing I've noticed the most is when in a space where you're not competing for those customers, reliability and safety become kind of take on a different life, where they are not assessed against things like, the cost of that against a marketing budget or against a customer campaign or some of these other things where I have to struggle to create and maintain edge over my peers. I see a lot more collaboration in this industry, and it gives me confidence and optimism towards the ability to continue to work in a collaborative way and find the creative solutions to a lot of these very serious problems.
Actually, I was just on another podcast recently. We were talking about the way this NERC and FERC and Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy are all involved in some aspect of regulation, particularly around cybersecurity. Do you think that's a good method and a good way for the system to operate, or could there be a more efficient solution there?
I think that the difficulty that we tend to see is you have a lot of groups there with kind of overlapping spheres of influence. And I think the biggest struggle that any of us would ever say is, if mom gave you instructions and dad gave you different instructions as a little kid, what do you do? And not suggesting that the industry is functions as a child, but more that if you're getting directives coming from all these different directions, you have to prioritize those. And if they end up at cross purposes or you have kind of policy misalignments, I think that that's where you have some of these really big struggles to try and make sure that, do they align with your customer needs? Do they align with your state level regulators? Do they align with your other contracts with your peers? And then going back up to the federal space, finding appropriate alignment with those, it's a elusive target, but it's always worth chasing. And so I think that it's a matter of making sure the utilities continue to feel empowered to make their case and work towards a kind of that more resilient space.
I'm assuming you've heard about the recent fine that was levied against an unnamed power company for cybersecurity breaches. I think it was $10 million or $10.5 million. How do you feel about that sort of repercussions to a security event?
So I think from a policy perspective, you often have very limited ways to incentivize action. And typically you'll see that through rebates or penalties. In this case, I think, when I read the article about this one, and I think I'm familiar with this as one from about a month ago, mm-hmm. The struggle that I saw described in the article was, this is where kind of the data analytics side of me chirps up a bit more. And it looks at things like some of the fines were related to things like limited management oversight and limited ability to respond to input. So making sure that, if I go back to the mission focus for Maryville of the having a question, having clearly identified business need. And in this case, I think that now that utility would say that they've identified the value of this by the fine that was paid. But I think otherwise, there's still the cost of not having the visibility to some of these things. So making sure that you've got a good construct in place to be able to share data across your entity, understanding what the appropriateness of your data to share across is. So, classifying effectively, sharing across systems, making sure that you have a useful and actionable data strategy is truly useful. Being able to combine data across systems. So looking at things like your SCADA systems, your AMI systems from the OT side, combining that with the IT infrastructure that you have in place to protect those assets in the field, being able to come up with the compelling questions that would drive things like, how do we keep these assets secure in the field? How do we identify risks? How do we identify anomalous behavior? A lot of this becomes kind of those complex trend style analysis that eventually gets you to a predictive analytics model where you can start to say things like, how do I intelligently understand where my next risk will be? How do I intelligently understand where my next resiliency question will be? And I think positioning utilities to be able to address those in advance of an issue is really important.
And before we go, could you just tell a little bit about Guidehouse and what you guys do?
So I work for Guidehouse, which as of July of 2018 is a new name in the industry. But prior to that, we were known as PricewaterhouseCoopers Public Sector, and we provide services to the federal space as well as to aerospace, finance, or the financial sector and healthcare. We have other industries that we continue to work with, as is the case with me working with our utility companies, but we continue to be focused on client mission, client needs, and the ability to grow to address those needs. So I would absolutely reach out to folks to say, please visit our site, and if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me or to any of the other folks listed on our site for specific needs.